They had gathered in the parlor before the curtains were drawn, the servants already elsewhere, the house holding its breath like a lung paused between two blows. On the center table lay a folded sheet of paper sealed in black wax, the small coin of a man's last authority. Around it, the room arranged itself into the ranks of a society that believed a signature could reorder human lives. The morning light slanted through high windows, catching dust and the gilt of the mantel, and for a moment the air smelled faintly of ink and beeswax and the lingering candle grease of a household that kept its grief in the manner of its mourning, neat, seam-pressed, proper. If you want the whole account, stay with this till the end and consider subscribing. There is much to tell. James Whitfield stood with the paper in his hand like a man who had learned how to make the past legible. He had come into the room thin from the long vigil of law and letter, his coat still shaking with the dew of the road, his face pressed into the stoical lines a life of court had carved there. Margaret Thornton sat opposite him in black silk, hands clasped as if holding the shape of a life she expected to continue. Thomas Thornton, tall and taut, favored a posture of readiness and law, a brother used to moving property as if it were a ledger to be balanced. Robert's children, Marcus, Sarah, and Thomas, sat stiff, their faces a mixture of expectation and the small terror children take in when adults speak of money and fate. In the doorway, unseen by most, but present in the room as surely as the shuttered windows, Eliza stood at the threshold. Eliza had come in that morning, as she had every morning for then 20 years, with a tray to set tea, hands measured and steady. She had smoothed the napkin, set porcelain into place. She had watched, unseen, the family make its small cruelties and tender anxieties, learned the cadence of sighs and silences, collected the crumbs of private lives that fell from the table of a household into which she had been born and had been kept. The paper in Whitfield's hand was of a different weight than the household letters she had folded in the pantry. It had a gravity that reached into the rooms she had not been permitted to enter. When Whitfield broke the seal, quick, precise, the professional motion, sound that had never been sacred in that house became sacrament. The page unfolded. The voice that read the words found its way around sentences and names and sums and returns, but always circled back to one impossible thing: that the Master had written of her. That Robert Thornton, in his hand, had set down the name that others refused to name in decent company, and had ascribed to it property, personhood, contingency. The room shifted. Margaret's fingers tightened until the silk creased. Thomas's jaw worked. The children looked to their father's letters in a way that was not quite belief, not quite recognition. What did not change in the fragments was the outcome. 5 men died that night, and the city burned afterwards in a panic that mixed grief and revenge, and the fear that the fracture in social order might widen. Robert Thornton's involvement was subtle in the retellings. He had not been the one to issue the command at arm's length. He had been at his house miles away when the overseer, a man named Crane, tall, precise, a man who kept his whip like a ledger, had staged an event he called sport. But ownership carries with it a responsibility that the law did not always name. In his correspondence, recovered later among boxes of letters, Robert had written to Margaret in tones of embarrassment and worry, that the overseer had gone beyond instruction, that the spectacle had been meant to appease restless men who had never been taught humanity, that the city's fires had started in the chaos that followed the duel. Kingdoms of smoke where people tried to reckon immediacy with moral distance. Eliza's memory of that night was not an abstract historical fact. It was a sequence of small months that arranged themselves into a narrative of survival. The duel had been an excuse to pit one human against another on the soil of subjugation. Families had been pulled into yards and forced into stakes. A man could be bought and sold as an entry on a ledger, but could not, by law, be a subject of pity. After the duel, after the burning that seemed to spread from pour to brick, the plantation's discipline changed subtly. Stricter inspection, less leniency for small liberties, more emphasis on separation. Some men were sold off to other plantations. Some women worked longer days, their children taken into the quarters of overseers for protection. The overseer's cruelty shaped a household economy of fear. And the memory of that night threaded itself through Eliza's body. The taste of smoke that would never leave her tongue. The image of the square in Charleston smudged with ash. And the names of men who would not speak again. Robert Thornton's private letters, those Whitfield would later produce in court, showed a man who had lived under the pressure of appearances. He wrote about the duel with a complex mixture of culpability and rationalization. "Crane exceeded," he wrote once, "and for that I regret. Yet this house, this family, must be kept intact." To Margaret he expressed sorrow. To himself he often confessed a terror of weakness. That to be seen as lenient would be to invite the scorn of men who measured authority in blood and sale. The letters reveal a dissonance between private conscience and public performance. A man who sometimes felt distressed at what had been done, and yet kept the machinery of domination running as if the house demanded it. The will, later in life, would read to that private conscience in ways that the public would later find scandalous and to some morally improvised. Whitfield's presence as attorney intersected both law and narrative. They in times the household sought to isolate her. They understood that what was at stake was more than land. It was the recognition, however constrained, that someone whom the law had long treated as chattel could claim personhood. Courtroom days came with the brittle heat of late summer. Judge Foster presided with the slow, measured temperament of a man who had seen the law used for both order and injustice. His courtroom was wood-paneled and smelled of tar and dust. It held not only the legal machinery of a county, but the weight of the society's expectations. Whitfield presented Robert's letters and the will. Thomas presented testimony that tried to render the document less a confession and more a perversion of duty. Witnesses were brought forward. Aunt Bessie and Aunt Ruth, both older women whose recollections carried the cadence of care and survival, testified to Eliza's years of service and to incidents that suggested both coercion and a complicated intimacy. Samuel, who had once labored in the fields and was known for his steady demeanor, spoke of the duel's aftermath with the restraint of a man who had survived by keeping his mind sharp. He spoke of men who had been sold shortly after the duel, of children separated, and of how the plantation had tightened its schedule of humiliation. His words, like the other testimonies, operated less as salacious revelation than as documentation of harm. Whitfield's cross-examination of witnesses often focused on establishing the timeline. That Robert's hand had written the will on dates that matched a late-life reckoning. That the words were his, undebated in ink.
that the bequests had been deliberate. He argued the legal possibility of bequeathing freedom and property, while clarifying the practical constraints: trust funds to be regulated, guardianships to manage money until minors came of age, the legal precariousness for free persons of color in a state whose statutes limited their mobility and rights. He was careful to make plain: the law could do some things and could not undo others. It could recognize legal freedom and land transfer, but it could not turn back the clock on families torn apart by sale or erase the overseer's deeds. Thomas Thornton's position relied upon the social grammar of white respectability. He asked the court to see the will as an aberration that needed correction. He painted images of a family's reputation sullied, of neighbors scandalized, of the formal obligations that bound property to the lineage of a family. When pressed, he revealed thinly veiled contempt for the notion that a man like Robert, in his decline, could be trusted to have the lucidity to redistribute wealth against expectations. His argument carried with it a paradox: that the legal machinery of the county was in place to preserve social forms that made injustice appear natural. Judge Foster's ruling came in December 1854 with a tone of pragmatism that concealed in ink a moral calculus. He did not wholly overturn the will. Marcus, who entered into military service with the Union, returned to become a teacher in a town that was always remaking itself. Sarah married a minister and built a household that tried, within the constraints of the times, to claim a gentler piety than the one that had ruled her grandfather's house. Thomas studied law and bent his energy to the idea that the law could be a tool, if imperfect, for rectifying at least some inequities. Eliza died in 1889. Her children, by then adults of varied paths, held the legal title to the North Tract in diminished value, and with a heritage of memory that sometimes measured more than money could account for. The duel and the burning of Charleston, once a rumor, had become an interpretive axis for what the will meant. For some, Robert's bequest was an act of conscience, a late attempt to atone for what his household had done, and for the overseer's cruelty that had run like a current through the years. For others, it was a final act of control, to decide the terms of freedom, to choose beneficiaries, to stipulate how black lives might be returned in a fashion that minimized white accountability. The law's capacity for making moral claims is limited. It moves property. It recognizes names. It sets the terms of guardianships and trusts. But it cannot always deliver the dignity of a life lived without the shadow of ownership. The community that had watched the will's reading saw in Robert's hand both an admission and an evasion. Inside the courtroom, testimony sometimes cut like a scalpel, clean and precise. Samuel's recollection of the duel's aftermath became a document of witness, not merely memory. He recited the names of men who had been taken and sold after the night of the duel, spoke quietly of the women left behind, who wrapped their grief in daily tasks, and of the ways the overseer's favor could both protect and doom. Aunt Bessie recalled nights of tending a fevered child who had once belonged to a man sent away. Aunt Ruth, who had been present the morning Robert's will was raised, described the hush that had fallen in the parlor and Eliza's steady breaths at the doorway. Each testimony, in the aggregate, formed a map of harm and endurance, a social cartography that law alone could not fully wrestle with. Judge Foster's decision showcased the law's cunning at compromise. He wrote of the need to respect the deceased's intentions, yet he tempered them with safeguards that reflected the anxieties of a community uneager to accept radical reconfiguration.
The balance he struck allowed Eliza legal recognition that had once been unthinkable in writing. It also preserved the old order in its essentials by distributing assets in ways that still respected family lines. As Reconstruction swept across the landscape, the plantation economy revealed its brittle bones. Of the 800 acres given to Eliza, some were reclaimed by debt, some eroded by neglect, and some were held fast by the stubborn labor of people determined to carve out a life. Marcus's service in the Union ranks changed him. He returned to teach because he had learned that knowledge could be a form of landholding as tangible as fences, property of the mind. Sarah's marriage to a minister offered a new kind of shelter, yet even that life had to be negotiated against the ghost of the house where she had been born. Thomas's legal training became a channel for advocacy, a way of making law an instrument not only of preservation but of amendment. In the epilogue of these events, if epilogue can mean the slow unwinding of consequence, Eliza's descendants kept the North Tract in diminished valuation. They tended the land with the knowledge that it represented both a legal victory and the residue of harm. The letters of Robert found after her death remained a complicated archive, evidence of a conscience that had stirred late, but not proof that an accounting of moral debt could be satisfied with ink. The overseer's cruelty remained, in many ways, not so much a single sentence as an ongoing plotline in the household's memory, a reoccurring motif that explained behaviors and resentments for generations. The question that the story leaves lingered like smoke in the county's air. Did the will matter? Legally, it mattered. It changed titles, established trusts, and freed children in the eyes of the law. Socially, it mattered. It forced town conversations, alienated neighbors, and opened small avenues of economic independence. Morally, it was ambiguous, a last act of a man still embedded in a system he rarely challenged, a document that attempted to put some measure of harm right, but could not restore what had been taken in body and in time. The duel and the burning in 1836 had been a rupture, and the will was one of many attempts to repair, to stitch, to name. Yet stitches do not erase scars. On the mantel of the house, in the drawer where old letters lay, the sealed wax of Robert's earlier instructions remained a symbol. Wax could be warmed and resealed. Its impression could be read or misread. In the end, the law had done what law could do. The community had done what community could do. The people who had suffered had survived with dignity and grief braided together, and they had made of the North Tract a place of memory as much as material interest. Standing on the threshold, Eliza, in her life and in memory, was an image of what happens when a system yields, a little, to the claims of those it had long suppressed. The story of the overseer, the duel, and the burning of Charleston remained part of that larger fabric, a reminder that cruelty can be both spectacular and bureaucratic, that violence can be a show and a ledger entry at once. It forced a reckoning that a will alone could not complete. The legal victory validated a person. It did not erase the overseer's deed or the price exacted by a society that counted human beings in price and pound. If this tale held a final note, it was this: that history's instruments, paper, seal, court, can confer recognition, but moral repair requires ongoing practice. The people who lived through the will and its consequences understood that better than the county clerks and the merchants.
Their acts of community, their insistence on education and memory, their refusal to allow names to be erased from family history, became the true work of restitution across generations. If you found this compelling and want more deep dives into cases where law and conscience collide, subscribe, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this story so others can reckon with the past alongside us. Not all reckonings arrived at once. They threaded through seasons, came in the small increments of habit and omission. A schoolroom opened in a refurbished tenant house where Marcus taught boys and girls to read the letters their parents had been forbidden to sign. A Sunday congregation that Sarah and her husband led, where hymns braided grief into hope, and the pulpit's cadence kept names alive. A clerk's ledger in which Thomas found, again and again, the faint fingerprints of the county's old machinery. These acts were not headline-making justice. They were architecture of survival. The North Tract was never merely land. It was a geography of testimony. Plum and pear trees planted by hands that had planted more than orchards. A fence line mended in the spring by cousins who remembered who had been buried under the sycamore. A kitchen garden where women taught the next generation to stretch a portion of flour into a meal enough for a family. When the tobacco market fell, when a drought burned the corn to a bitter ash, when a new county tax assessment named values that felt like betrayal, the families turned to one another. They pooled what little cash they could spare, and they pooled their memory. A child who could recite the names on Robert's will could be steadier before a stranger than a man who had never learned the year of a baptism. Trouble still found them.
The late decades of the century brought men with measuring rods and polite forms, men who spoke of progress and rails and of lines to be run across every map like a needle through cloth. In the summer, when cicadas drummed in the hedges, a surveyor came for the North Tract on behalf of a consortium that wanted a spur line to a new mill. His papers bore county seals. His manner was apologetic. He walked the field with a young engineer, and he pointed out the strand of land that would ease the route. Eminent domain, he said, as if the phrase were a comfort. There was no one to sign for Eliza, and no one to counter the smoothness of a man with county papers, except those who remembered. Marcus stood beside the surveyor, where the soil ran soft and black. His hands were stained with chalk and the dust of chalkboards. He had seen other men arrive with forms and promises. Thomas, older now, with a carriage in his walk that gave away late nights of poring over cases, brought with him the thin sheaf of Robert's will and the other papers he had not ceased to collect, receipts, a canceled note, a petition to the county from the year after the burning. Sarah came in her modest hat, the sort of steadiness that comes from prayer lived out more than spoken. Around them were cousins and grandchildren, the scattered heirs who had kept the North Tract in part by dint of stubborn thrift and by virtue of what forces they could muster. "We have title," Thomas said to the surveyor, and he set the will on a stone as if it were an amulet. He did not shout. The surveyor did not leave, but he marked a corner in his book. The county, Thomas knew, would be moved by law more than by argument, and law could be coaxed or confronted. He had learned to read the script of power, where the edges of a deed could be made to fray, where an assessor could be convinced to change a line, where a judge might be inclined to favor a public good. That night, Thomas sat with the will under lamplight and traced Robert's signature until the letters seemed less like a man's handwriting and more like a riddle the community had to solve. When the condemnation notice arrived, framed in stenographer's language and stamped with the county seal, the family saw two kinds of threat. There was the immediate loss of acreage, a narrow cut through a field where a boy had once hidden eggs on Easter. There was also the precedent, a county right claimed over private memory. To let the surveyor's tape fall across the North Tract was to allow an argument that the future could pluck pieces from the past without asking whether what was taken carried names and graves and promises. Thomas filed papers. He filed quickly and without flourish, appealing to statutes and to any precedents he could summon. The case would go before a county judge who had been appointed to his bench in a season of politics and who had little taste for complicated histories. The hearings gathered townspeople in the gallery, friends of the family, neighbors who remembered when the overseer's shadow fell across the town, and, opposite them, representatives of the consortium in clean collars, their clerk carrying blueprints. The trials of memory do not unfold like the neat dramas of novels. They come with interruptions, lost deposition transcripts, a witness who cannot travel because a child is sick, a petition lost in a clerk's drawer. Yet the hearing pressed forward enough to force a truth into the light. Thomas called as witness a woman named Hester, who had been a child during the burning. Her voice trembled at first, then hardened into the plain recitation of fact. Where the overseer had stood, the smell of smoke after the fire, the name he had called her with, the time she had been turned away from the market. The consortium's counsel cross-examined with a practiced politeness, trying to reduce a life's testimony to an anecdote. Hester's answers, however, made a different kind of argument. Not only that harm had occurred, but that harm had a pattern, and that pattern bore on the meaning of the land. And then Thomas placed before the court a document that had for years been more a domestic relic than a legal instrument, the overseer's ledger. It was not a confession, and it contained nothing sensational. A list of purchases, of calls made to suppliers, of a ledger of fines imposed on workers for misdemeanors that read, when Thomas translated them for the judge, like thin tethers on a person's liberty. The ledger also contained an entry that, at first glance, seemed innocuous. A payment, months after Robert's will had been filed, to a man who had been recorded as leaving the county. It was the kind of small detail that, stitched together with other small details, formed a different narrative than the one the consortium wished to tell. The judge listened. His notes were sparse. The law, he said, required a weighing of public need and private right. He was a man who had watched industries come and go on the promises of good roads and better wages. He had also watched families scatter. He requested a delay, an investigation into whether the spur could be rerouted. The consortium protested. They argued of timetables and investors. The town murmured. The family waited. Months later, the spur was rerouted. It was not in any grand sense a vindication. The consortium paid a small sum for the delay it had incurred, and it sought other lines. But for many of those gathered at the farmhouse that night, the reroute felt like a kind of moral geometry. Land had been spared a cut, and so the North Tract remained a continuous place. That continuity let the family continue to keep its burials unbroken, its orchards unbisected, its children's playfields intact. It let them keep, most importantly, the associative fabric that bound their names to the land. This small legal victory did not settle everything.
Some of Eliza's descendants left for those towns or for city streets farther north, carrying in luggage the husks of the family library. Others stayed, and their lives became a different kind of project. Stewardship, not of a neat verdict, but of erosion and renewal. They tended the orchard, repaired the fence, taught their children the stories that could not be found in any ledger. And then, toward the turn of a new century, a small event occurred that illustrated how the past continued to unsettle what people thought they had settled. A school teacher from the county seat, working on a local history project, wrote to the congregation with a request. Might they allow access to the letters in the farmhouse for copying? The request arrived like a breeze that could be either cool or chilling. Some in the family feared commodification, another kind of taking, this time of their private grief. Others saw the chance for recognition, an assurance that Eliza's name would be recorded beyond the county margins. The debate that followed was intimate and fierce, less about archival ethics than about community identity. If the letters were published, would their story be simplified into a single chapter in a textbook? If they remained closed, would the local record keep the family's existence at the margins, a footnote in others' histories? In the end, they chose a middle path. A convening was held beneath the oak Marcus had used as a meeting place. They agreed to allow copies to be made, but only on terms. A written statement would accompany the copies, recounting the nuance of events. The family would have voice in how their story was told. Any proceeds from publication would be set into the trust that Thomas managed for communal needs. The school teacher, surprised by the gravity of the request, accepted. It was a modest triumph. One more stitch in the slow labor of restitution. There were no revelations that rewrote the past. The letters confirmed ordinary things. Robert's uneven pen, his late regret, the overseer's procedural cruelty. They also contained smaller intimacies. A line about a child's laughter that carried no legal weight but a great human one. A mention of a favorite dish, a passing apology to a wife for absences, the way a man could feel remorse without knowing how to name it. The publication that followed years later, humble, local, respectful, did more than preserve text. It forced a small town and its neighbors to read an account of themselves with a different viewfinder. It allowed a classroom to see not only the law's instruments, but the lives those instruments affected. The North Tract endured, in part because of these accretions of care. A school that taught rights, a church that kept names, a lawyer who argued for continuity, a family that sometimes sold acres and sometimes refused to.
Esta é a conclusão. Aumente a emoção para o nível máximo, mantendo a potência e termine com uma pausa solene e impactante. The will mattered because it had initiated a legal shift. Yet the larger repair, the kind that human beings measure by dinners shared, and children raised, and names passed along at funerals, required different labor. That labor, the daily tending of memory and mutual aid, proved harder and more durable than any single paper. And so the story continued, not toward a tidy resolution, but toward the living complexities of family, law, and memory. New births and new deaths threaded the years. The North Tract kept its scars and its sudden green places. It remained, in the minds of many who lived there, a mapped archive of what had been endured and what had been defended.
The shadows of the overseer's rule did not vanish by decree. They softened where people refused to let them shape every relation. In that moderation of history, neither absolution nor perpetual grievance, the community built a fragile, steady peace. At dusk, the oak stood as it had for generations, its roots tangled with the past, and its canopy open to whatever would come. A child from the North Tract sat beneath it one afternoon, a folded letter in small hands, reading aloud the names that had once been only margins. The sound was simple and brave, a lineage reclaimed by voice. Someone in the house down the lane hung a lantern by the gate each night, neither as penance nor as triumph, but as habit, an act of tending that made the property livable and the memory hospitable. In that slow maintenance, the town found its way forward, not by erasing the ledger of harm, but by learning how to feed the living with what remained. So life went on. Harvests, funerals, school books annotated with careful footnotes, neighbors who showed up with stew when seasons turned cruel. The North Tract kept its scars and its sudden green places, and in the ordinary work of keeping names and meals and promises, history was softened into something like continuance.